ends up being on YouTube, and we're here on Zoom as well. Welcome, dear friends. We have a fascinating discussion tonight, which is so relevant to so many of us and to where we are historically speaking now, today, 2021, 5781, which is where we are in Jewish history, and God willing, moving on from. I've traveled to a few parts of the world, and I have friends who've traveled further out into the world, and people who are Jewish usually like meeting other Jewish people on vacation. It makes them feel good. Sometimes you're walking around Brooklyn or New Jersey or London or Paris, and you see Jews all the time, your friends, your family, community. I need a break. And then you go on vacation and you meet someone in the middle of nowhere, and, oh, you're Jewish? Oh, you know the Goldbergs? Oh, that's a nice feeling, right? Oh, you know the Cohens from Manhattan? I get asked that a lot, by the way. Rabbi, you work in New York. Do you know the Cohens from New York? I'm like, I do. I know hundreds of them. And it's a nice feeling. And it is a good feeling. It's a feeling of connection, familiarity. And that's obviously a great thing. However, it's not the ideal. The ideal for us, the Jewish people, is not to have our nation spread out throughout the world in the Dalet Kanfot Aretz, in the four corners of the earth. There's a reason that happened. There's a number of reasons why it happened. However, us, the Jewish people, being exiled from our homeland, the land of Israel, is not our optimal state. It's not the best place for us to be. So although you may go on vacation, or you may go traveling around the world, and you meet Jews, and you meet French Jews, and Russian Jews, and Chinese Jews, and Orange Jews, and all the rest of it, it's not the best place for us, being outside of our homeland. And the word that we're going to repeat a number of times in today's discussion is Gallut, exile. And Gallut, exile, can mean one of two things. Usually both, but not always. And that is to be exiled from our homeland, from the land of Israel. That's going to be one interpretation. A geographical displacement of the Jewish people from their national homeland, Israel. But there's another form of exile, which is not as common, but is still common. And that is, we are still in possession of the land of Israel, but the final redemption has not happened. And God's presence, as it were, his Shekhinah, is exiled from among us. How did we get to this point? And truth is, the Jewish people have been through a number of exiles. It goes back. Abraham was told that his descendants would be strangers in a strange land. He wasn't told who our hosts were going to be. That position was left open. There was a nation called the Mitzrim, the Egyptians, who, as it were, put their hand up and said, we'll take them. And maybe that role wouldn't have been so bad. However, they misused their power and they ended up hurting us for 210 years before we were redeemed in the Jewish year 2448. It's about 3,338 years ago or so ago. And we were redeemed. And of course, that's the whole Pesach story. But that exile was not the major exile of the Jewish people, because since that time, we have been through 4 exiles. And each one of these exiles, each one of these galuts, each one of these geographical displacements of the Jewish people from their national homeland, from the land of Israel, has taken a major toll upon us as a people, physically, emotionally, psychologically. But even so, we're going to see there's a few reasons why we had to go through it. And so while Abraham was told his descendants would be going through exile, And according to many, that exile began, the Egyptian exile began with the birth of his son Yitzchak Isaac, which began a 400-year period from his birth till the exodus from Egypt. Even so, it was Abraham's grandson, Jacob Yaakov, who was told explicitly about another 4 exiles that his descendants would go through. And that was left to Yaakov, Jacob, because it was only Jacob who had fully Jewish children and descendants for the future. You see, Abraham had an Isaac, but he also had Ishmael. And Ishmael was not part of this. And Isaac, Yitzchak, had a son called Yaakov, but also a son called Esav. And Esav was not part of this either. However, Yaakov, the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac, of Yitzchak, was going to be the sole patriarch that all of his descendants would go into Gallup. And so that's Yaakov. And the revelation happened to Yaakov in a dream, which we've spoken about in the past, came in the form of a prophecy. And the prophecy came as a ladder. And the ladder appeared to Jacob in his dream, Jacob's ladder, while he was lying on Mount Moriah, which was going to be the future site of the temple, where so much of the exile of the Jewish people was going to be centered on and around in the city of Jerusalem, the holy city of his descendant, King David and King Solomon. And so Jacob was told that your descendants won't only be in Egypt, but they're going to go through 4 exiles. And the 4 angels that Jacob saw in his dream climbed up a ladder and then climbed down. They ascended Oilim, the Yordim, and then they descended that ladder. And each one went up a different number of rungs. And each rung on that ladder represented a year. And so, my dear friends, the first angel represented the Babylonian exile that the Jewish people were going to go through. And that angel ascended 70 rungs and then came down 70 rungs, which represented that the Jewish people would be exiled by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, for 70 years. And then they would be able to be released from that exile and return to the land of Israel. But even that second time in the land of Israel was represented afterwards by another angel, the Persian Median angel, that ascended 52 rungs and then came down. That represented 52 years, was represented that Jacob's descendants would be in exile for another 52 years. And then they would return. And they would go through a third exile, the Greek exile. And that exile was going to last for 130 years. And Jacob saw that as the Greek angel ascending 130 rungs and then coming down after 130 years, meaning the end of that exile. And then Jacob saw a 4th angel. And that angel ascended, and it went up and up and up and up. And it never came down. And Jacob became very, very nervous. He became terrified. And he said, God, what's going on over here? Who is this 4th angel? And God said, that's the angel of Edom, or Romi, as it's sometimes called. That's Rome as we understand it. And that exile is going to go on a long time. Centuries and centuries. Millennia. But don't worry, said God. There'll be a time when even that 4th and final exile will end. And there will be a conclusion. And that exile will conclude with the arrival of the Messiah, the return of the Jewish people in totality to the land of Israel, with a new kingship, with a 3rd and final temple built on Mount Moriah, which was exactly where Jacob was having this dream and this prophecy. And on hearing this news, he felt a little bit better, and he continued his journey outside of Israel. And that's why Jacob was also the patriarch chosen to be the deliverer and the informer of this information. Because Jacob represents Gallup exile. Why? Because Jacob was the one who was exiled from the land of Israel when he had to escape from his twin brother Esau, who was going to chase him and kill him. And so Jacob had to flee and live by his uncle Lavan, his mother Rivka's brother Lavan. He ended up getting married to Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, having many descendants, and then his descendants one day returned to Israel, just like the Jewish people are going to return to Israel en masse. So those are the 4 exiles. Let's do them again. I'm going to go through them in a lot more detail in about 5 minutes or so. We have the Babylonian exile. We have the Persian exile that we'll talk about soon. That's going to be the Purim story. We have the Greek exile. That's going to be the exile of the Hanukkah story. And the 4th exile, which for now I'm going to say is the final exile, but I'm going to give a class the next few weeks or so where we're going to talk about a 5th and final exile, which is a much deeper and fascinating discussion, but that's not for now. We're going to focus on these 4 this evening because they have made up the bulk of Jewish history from our arrival in the land of Israel under Joshua, who took over from Moses, to the present day where we are. That's where we are, dear friends. We are going now to try to figure out why exile? Why does God take his people, assuming that God loves the Jewish people, wants us to be safe and happy and calm and living tranquil and serene lives in the land of Israel? Why does God allow it to happen? I mean, he has various agents that he uses to kick us out, the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans. But why? Why does God allow it to happen? And we're going to look at 3 and maybe 4 reasons. And these are very, very important, integral ideas in understanding not only the Jewish people and our mission in this world, but the reason for all of Jewish history and therefore all of world history. Question is, once again, why do we need to go through exile? Why can't we just stay in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, Netanya, Tiberia, the Golan, Elah, wherever we are, in the Negev, and just enjoy being in the land of Israel that we've done for hundreds and hundreds of years during the first and second temple? And here are a few answers I would like to suggest. Reason number 1, that the Jewish people had to go through the Egyptian exile, which, by the way, was so bad, it's going to represent all the 4 following exiles. Every one of these 4 can be found in this first Egyptian exile, which is why we make such a big deal out of the Egyptian exile, because everything you need to know about the Jewish people and the genesis, literally, of our nation can be found somewhere in that story and those events, which, of course, is the Pesach story. So number 1 is, we mess up. As we say in the Musaf of Shabbat, Mipnei Chatainu, because of our sins, Galinu mi'arseinu, we were kicked out. You see, living in Israel safely and securely comes with a responsibility. And sometimes we've lived up to that responsibility, but let's be honest, and it's not me speaking, Jewish history and the rabbis tell us very clearly in many, many places, sometimes we forfeit our right to remain in the land of Israel. We don't deserve it. That's a very big and harsh statement, and I'm not making it. The rabbis tell us this. We are the first who don't just look at the people who hurt us, but look at ourselves and say, do we really deserve this? And therefore, we forfeit our right, and we actually are our own worst enemies. Because of our sins, God removes us from the land of Israel, just like a parent will remove their kids from their home, or the king kicks out his prince from the palace in order to learn that if you want to get better, I'm going to kick you out and you're going to see what the world is really like. And now, when you return, you're going to appreciate what you have. How do you get someone to appreciate a great gift? And there is no greater gift than the land of Israel for the Jewish people, and Jerusalem as our capital, and the temple on Temple Mount that is taken away. And now you're going to actually begin to appreciate it. So that's reason number 1. We cause our own demise. we don't take responsibility, we misbehave, and God removes us. Because the land of Israel, says Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, is like a sensitive stomach. Actually, the wording of the Torah itself is, in Parshat Kedoshim, is the land of Israel, Yokir Yoshvea, vomits out its inhabitants. It can't tolerate bad behavior. When there is avodah zarah, idol worship, when there is Gilead riots, forbidden sexual relationships, when there's shvi'at damim, murder, and everything that comes from those three, the land of Israel expels not only the Jewish people, but whoever has control of the land. And there have been many, many nations who have claimed and still claim control over the land of Israel. Although we know from the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land belongs to the Jewish people. So that's number one. The land of Israel is like a sensitive stomach. It doesn't tolerate sin. We get kicked out. Number two is a little bit Kabbalistic, but very, very deep. And that is, we humans really are in exile at all times. Because at some point, we weren't here alive on earth. Everyone watching today was at some point just a soul without a body. And our souls were kept in a storehouse, which the rabbis and the Kabbalists call the guf, the body. And at some point, that soul was thrown into this world. And it was given a klipa, it was given a husk called the body. And it's being held in that body for 80, 90, God willing, 120 years. And it was given a mission. But the soul is not comfortable here. This world, olam hazeh, where we live and work and do mitzvot and learn Torah and all the wonderful things that we do, is not the optimal location for the soul. So too, the Jew outside of Israel is, we are given an opportunity to see and experience the exile of the soul, our own souls, from heaven. And the Jewish people represent a collective human soul. And we speak out and say, hey, we, the Jewish people, are exiled from our spiritual land, just like you in your soul are exiled from heaven. But don't worry, you too will return there one day, just like the Jewish people will return to our spiritual source, the land of Israel, Jerusalem, and eventually, God willing, the spiritual holy temple, the third and final temple on Mount Moriah. And so those are two reasons. One, we made mistakes and were kicked out. Two, exile is part of the human condition. And the Jewish people represent the Torah mitzvah, the soul of the world. And therefore we were kicked out in order to show the world that this is not the natural state of the Jewish people and of our souls. The third and maybe fourth final reason is, I consider, the most fascinating and really the most relevant now, because this is all coming to a head. So once again, what are we talking about? Why the Jewish people need to go to exile? We said we had one big exile, the Egyptian exile, which ended after 210 years with the exodus from Egypt. Actually 400 years after the birth of Isaac. And that was told to Abraham. And then we said not only that, we're going to be 4 exiles following that were revealed to Jacob in his dream. And those 4 exiles lasted a certain amount of time. And he saw them in his dream. And actually, Jacob even saw when the end of days was going to come. He was forbidden to reveal that information of when the Messiah's final arrival would come. That was closed off from him. He was not permitted to reveal that to his children in the world. Some of his children did know. Joseph probably did know. But more than that, they didn't know. Why exile? The third and fourth final reasons are that the Jewish people, being the holders of the Torah and the fulfillers of the mitzvot that are in the Torah, represent a divine consciousness in this world. And if that's true, which it is, we have a role. And that role is to spread the Torah, moral and ethical teachings to all the inhabitants of the earth. Because we, the Jewish people, don't have a monopoly on God. When we talk about God, we talk about God of the entire world, of every human, throughout all of history. So how are those people going to experience divine consciousness? There's a way. God says, I can keep you in Israel, but you know what? You're not going to be able to spread what I need you to spread. You're not going to give what I need you to give. So what I'm going to do at certain points of world history, I'm going to disperse you throughout the four corners of the earth. And you're going to bring a divine consciousness to every place that you go. And it's so true. There are millions of people who have experienced the idea of Judaism, of Torah, mitzvot, in some different way to some degree. Whether they were in Russia, where the Jews were in France, where the Jews were in Poland, in Germany, go back to Babylon, go back to wherever we were, Spain, the Jews were there. And they had an impression, they had an impact on the people around them. Those people didn't necessarily become Jewish, but through the learning of the Bible. I mean, let's be honest, all of Christianity, all of Islam, and many other religions experience God because the Jewish people were given the Torah on Mount Sinai. It may not be a direct connection, but at least it's an indirect or an indirect connection to the Jewish people and God giving us the Torah on Mount Sinai a few thousand years ago. So God says, I'm going to spread you around so you can have an influence. And by the way, we saw this in the life of Abraham and Jacob, his grandson, because Abraham was told to go to the land of Israel. And then he was exiled to Egypt. And then he made his way back. And then Jacob was in Israel. And he was exiled and spread divine consciousness to where he went. And then he went back. And they were telling us, and the Torah is telling us, and God is telling us that you too are going to be exiled like your forefather Abraham and his wife Sarah, and your forefather Jacob and his wives, and you too are going to be able to spread a divine consciousness throughout the world. And connected to this is the fourth reason. You got one extra bonus point, and that is, my friends, because we need to attract converts. There are souls that, for reasons which I'm not going to get into right now, this will be a topic of its own discussion, where converts come from. I am going to do a talk, and it's a fascinating discussion because even before this conversation, I was talking to a potential convert. Much of my life is talking to potential converts, many converts themselves, people going through conversion, which I'm involved in, and after converts. That's a whole discussion. But one of the reasons the Jewish people were put into exile is in order to attract those souls that were secreted into other nations throughout the world, so they should meet a Jewish family, a Jewish community, a rabbi and a rebbitzin, learn about Judaism, because there was no internet going back in those days, right? And there weren't many books. So how did a person in China, how did a person in Russia, in France, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, 100 years ago, and before, become Jewish? They connected to a Jewish person who lived near them. And so the fourth reason, which connects to the third reason, is that God put us into exile so that we could pick up what is called the holy sparks of these future potential converts. And by the way, converts in history, again, this is its own discussion, but I'm going to mention it, are so important that the Messiah himself is going to be a descendant of King David, who himself was a descendant of Ruth, one of the greatest converts in Jewish history. The great Rabbi Akiva came from converts. Moses came and married a great holy woman called Zipporah, whose father, Jethro, Yitro, my Bar Mitzvah Parsha, right? Yitro himself was one of the great converts. So some of the greatest Jewish heroes and heroines were either themselves converts or were descendants of converts. And therefore, the Jewish people are going to have to leave the safety and comfort and serenity and tranquility of the land of Israel in order to go around the world and attract those converts into our midst. And that, my friends, is a crucial part of Jewish history and Jewish continuity. And eventually, Jewish redemption, because the Messiah is a direct descendant himself of a convert from a nation called Moab. Let's go back to these four exiles and let's double click on each one of them. There was a prophet by the name of Daniel. You may have heard of him. There was a very famous episode that most of you have heard of. He was trapped in a lion's den and he was not affected by those lions. But despite that one very important episode, he was also a very, very important and holy prophet for the Jewish people. And there was something revealed to him that was not revealed to anybody else. And that was the nature of the 4 exiles that actually he himself was part of. He was actually part of the first Babylonian exile, lived into the second, then died during it. And he even saw all 4 exiles. Not only that, he even knew, he was one of the few people in world history who knew the date and the time of the final redemption of the Jewish people, the coming of the Messiah. Now, when he saw these 4 exiles, these 4 chapters in Jewish history, he saw them in a very certain specific way. He saw them as beasts, as animals. Let's talk about them, because many times when a prophet received prophecy about the future, that prophecy is obviously very, very important, and someone of the caliber of Daniel the prophet was going to see extremely important prophecy. In chapter 7, we see 4 creatures that he saw in his nuvo, in his prophecy, which were going to influence the future of the Jewish people. Let's have a look at each one of them. The first beast that Daniel saw was a lion. And this lion wasn't any lion. It had eagle's wings. Eagle's wings. And these wings were very strong and very powerful on its back. Okay. Now, what exactly does this lion represent? This lion represents the first of the 4 exiles, the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians were a royal people. They acted in a royal way, and they were very, very strong. And Nebuchadnezzar had a certain royalty to him, represented by this lion. And these wings that were on the lion's back represented the great speed at which this lion was going to be able to conquer the world. And so Daniel realized that this beast was the Babylonian exile, this lion, this royal, powerful king of the animals. And he realized, and he actually lived through, he actually got to see firsthand this actual lion come to life, and the eagle's wings that sped it throughout the world. Eventually, he saw that the eagle's wings were plucked from it, and that represented the fall of this empire under someone called Belshazzar. Belshazzar took over many years later from Nebuchadnezzar and was involved in the decline of the Babylonian Empire. Who took over from the Babylonians? Well, that's going to be beast number 2, who represented the exile of the Persians and the Medians. And that's the Persian exile. And that came to Daniel in the form of a bear. And Daniel, in the book of Daniel, talks about a big, strong bear. Now, bears are strong animals, but they're also pretty big. They can be pretty slow-moving, and no one really called the bear the king of the jungle or the animal kingdom. And that was the Persians. They weren't regal in any way, and they appeared as a bear which is corpulent and full of itself and goes into a stupor and sleep at some times, and yet it's very, very powerful. In the mouth of the bear that Daniel saw in this vision were 3 ribs. And these 3 ribs, which represent the protective quality of the body, because the ribs protect us, represented 3 great leaders. Cyrus, who was good to the Jewish people and permitted us to go back and rebuild the temple. Achashverosh, sound familiar? He's from the Purim story. He's the second individual who stopped the rebuilding of the temple. The 3rd rib, however, was the child of Achashverosh, and according to our tradition, Esther as well. And that was Dariavesh, and he permitted the Jewish people to return and rebuild the 2nd temple after the 70 years that we were in Persian exile. So that's the 2nd beast that Daniel saw. And we, the Jewish people, survived, and that's the whole Purim story. After the Purim story, we were redeemed, we were able to survive, and a number of Jews, not all of them, only about 31-32% of the Jewish people of that time returned to the land of Israel under the leadership of Ezra and rebuilt the second temple on Mount Moriah. So beast number 1 was the lion with the eagle's wings. Beast number 2 was the bear, the slow-moving, corpulent creature. The third beast, however, was a little bit more scary. And beast number 3 was a leopard. And the leopard had 4 heads, says Daniel. And it had 4 wings coming out of its back. Who or what is represented by the leopard in Daniel's dream? So that was the great leopard, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, Greece. And he was an extremely great leader. And he had tremendous power and speed. He was able to conquer a vast amount, most of the Asian world in 12 years. However, sadly, he died very, very young, at the age of 32 years old. He achieved a vast amount in that short lifetime. And after he died, 4 generals took over. And they are represented by the 4 heads that were on this leopard. So you have a leopard, which is Alexander. Alexander comes into Israel, but doesn't mistreat the Jewish people and makes a peace pact with them. Actually, many people name their babies for 1 year Alexander. So any Alexanders you meet to this day usually are descendants of this period in Jewish history. But these 4 heads were bad because when Alexander died, 4 bad leaders took over. Ptolemy took over Egypt, Seleucus took over Syria and Babylon, Antigonus took over Persia and Asia Minor, and Philip, Alexander's brother, took over Macedonia. The Syrian Greeks had under their control the land of Israel. And, of course, in Israel was Jerusalem and the Second Temple that had stood for a couple of 100 years up to that point. And the Assyrian Greeks and eventually Antiochus IV took over control of the area of Jerusalem and all of Israel, most of Israel, I should say. And that's when the whole Hanukkah story kicks in. 200 years after the Jewish people returned, we're now in the 3rd exile. Now, this is very, very interesting. Why? Because the Jewish people are in the land of Israel. We're living there. Okay, the temple has been overrun by Greeks, and we are now forbidden to bring sacrifices, but we're still in Israel. And yet, this is called a Gallut, an exile. Because although we are geographically in the land of Israel, we are still spiritually disconnected from the temple, from the sacrifices, and we're not able to live spiritual, free lives in the land of Israel. Now that, my friends, is an exile. That's a Gallut. And that's the Greek exile. And of course, you know, the Maccabees came and they were able to remove the Greeks from the temple and they lit the Hanukkah lights and things carried on pretty okay for a couple 100 years until the 4th exile began. And if you remember from our beginning discussion, this is the 4th angel that Jacob saw in his dream that went up and up and up and up and up and he never saw come down. And that's the exile, my friends, that the Jewish people are still in now today. And that is the exile of Rome. The Romans exiled us. They destroyed, Titus came and destroyed the Second Temple. And Daniel saw this as an extremely terrifying, awesome, strong creature. We're not told what that creature is. We're just told that it was terrifying and large. And it had iron teeth and it had 10 horns coming out of it. And in the vision, the beast ate and crumbled using its large iron teeth. And Daniel became very, very disturbed when he saw this, because this represented the Roman Empire that he knew would stand strong for hundreds, if not thousands of years. What exactly do these 10 horns represent? Well, they represent, the 10 horn always represents power, and he saw a tremendous power. He saw the 10 emperors, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. And during Vespasian's reign, it was Titus who came along and destroyed the temple. And he saw these 10 horns, he saw these 10 leaders and realized that each and every one of them was going to cause tremendous pain, physical, emotional, spiritual pain to the Jewish people in the land of Israel and throughout the world. And that Rome would be the epicenter of that Gallut, although we would be in the 4 corners of the earth. Eventually he saw 3 horns come up, different opinions as to what these 3 horns that uprooted these other horns. Some say it represents the Titus who will be killed. Some say it's actually a reference to the final redemption, that all these 10 individuals would be disposed of and the Jewish people would come back. Where we are right now in world history, my friends, is really, really interesting, because we are right now in 2021, Jewish year 5781, are right at the end of this last and final exile that Jacob saw on Mount Moriah thousands of years ago, that the Romans began with the destruction of the Jewish temple. And yet the Jewish sources tell us, and the prophets tell us a number of times, just like Abraham got to return to Israel, just like Jacob got to return to the land of Israel, just like the Jewish people got to enter the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua, so too, at the end of days, we're going to come full circle. And our souls are going to return to the land of Israel for the final time. And that will be the end of all exiles. And that redemption will come at a very special time. At a time when all the Jewish people are going to start to be collected and rounded up from the 4 corners of the earth into the land of Israel. Now, if you would have said these words 80 years ago, 70 years ago, people would think you're absolutely nuts. Although there were Jews who are making aliyah from the 1800s and 1900s, I mean, there's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. There had to have been, because without that, many mitzvot that we have would not apply. So there's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. But if you were to say that there's going to be en masse, a movement in less than a century of millions of Jewish people to the land of Israel, say that to Jews in the Holocaust, right? They wouldn't believe you. Then within a few years, we're going to have sovereignty over the land of Israel. And we're going to have an air force and an army. And we're going to rebuild our nation, sometimes from scratch, post-Holocaust, sometimes from exile from all of the Arab countries that surround Israel, and start a whole nation in preparation for the arrival of the Messiah and the rebuild of the temple. People think you're nuts. And yet we've seen it miraculously appear before our very eyes. And so these 4 exiles will come to an end. Now, there are some writings that speak about a 5th and final exile, which I'm going to speak about in the future. But for now, my friends, let's realize that the fact we are in exile is not a coincidence, that it has a purpose, that it has a reason, that we're here to spread divine consciousness throughout the world, that we are here to open our doors to our people who've suffered thousands of years in exile with Holocaust and pogroms and persecutions, that we are here to welcome the ger, the convert, into our midst and to uplift them to become part of the Jewish nation. God willing, we'll see the end of this final exile and the return of all the Jewish people to the land of Israel, just like Daniel saw, just like Joseph and Jacob, Isaac and Abraham saw as well, because our ancestors waited a long time for this moment. But you know what? The moment has arrived. Thank you all very, very much. It was a pleasure seeing you all, and God willing, we'll continue our journeys into Jewish fundamentals next Tuesday night. Have a great and successful week. Thank you.